let me go ahead and, all right, what to expect in this hour. I'll go through, and I will say this. There are people here who may not have a whole lot of medical background. Maybe they're more into sales. Maybe we have people here who have done, they're orthopedists, they have tractioned 1,000 femurs, broad range. So I don't want to talk down to anybody, but I want to make it interesting for everybody. So what to expect in this hour, I'm going to talk briefly about why we use splints in general, as well as traction splints. I'll go through a little bit of the history, and that section could go for 2 or 3 hours. I had to really compact it quite a bit. I'll segue out to do some demos on my legs, and then I'll go back into the slides, do frequently asked questions, and then wrap up with future directions as well as answering people's questions along the way. All right, so let's dig into why we splint people. So, the reason for putting splints on in general is essentially to immobilize injured extremities. And it's more than just immobilizing extremity. I mean, you could give somebody a paralytic and that immobilizes them, but you want to immobilize and protect them. So if they're in a bouncy vehicle, you want to make sure that those fracture fragments are not rubbing up against each other or wiggling around. But you really want to be limiting pain as well. So splints limit pain. I had a person ask me the question, is there a difference between a device and a splint? So there's the Kendrick traction device and the Slishman traction splint. What's the difference? I think this lands somewhere in the realm of the art of medicine as well as the science of medicine. So to me, a splint is something that limits movement of an extremity as well as fracture fragments and just limits pain. And there's not a rigid definition of what is a splint, I think. If you think about a tourniquet, or if you don't stop arterial flow, you don't get to call yourself a tourniquet. But with a splint, I can use a rolled up newspaper to create a splint. So I don't think there's a real difference between splint versus device, the words. Splint stops movement of a broken limb or an injured limb of any kind. It doesn't even have to be broken. All right, you want to limit further damage with a splint. You want to maintain some level of fracture alignment. And what I will say, especially in pediatrics, I want to warn other people. So if I have a kid and they were on the trampoline, they have even just a buckle fracture, probably they're going to be fine without anything. The kids heal quite rapidly in general. But I'm going to put a splint on them to tell their friends, hey, be nice to that person. I'm also going to put a splint on them to protect them from themselves. So my kids, if they get a buckle fracture, they haven't yet, but could happen, probably they'll jump back into the trampoline shortly after. So I will put a splint on them to stop them from second and third injuries. All right, that's splints. Let's talk about traction splints. So the act of pulling a limb apart to give some level of relief and also to limit further injury. So, when I say immobilize fractured femurs, typically you could put traction on an arm, but most of the time when people talk about traction, they're talking about femoral traction, and that's what we're referring to today mostly as well. When somebody has a fractured femur, it's miserable. It's a pain spasm cycle, which is a horrible experience. And you'll see people will, what I say, auto splint. So they grab their leg and they're really trying to traction and splint their own limb. They will take it and they're trying to pull those parts apart. And if you can break that cycle, if you can knock out the spasm, then you can limit the pain quite a bit. So the traction part is quite useful, especially with femur fractures, because there's such thick muscle surrounding the broken bone. In theory, you're limiting blood loss too. So I've seen patients with broken femurs where their thighs are just huge, and they've certainly lost large volumes of blood into their thighs, and they can be hypotensive from that too. So you can bleed to death from a femur fracture without even having a laceration. So by pulling some traction, the way it's described, you're basically turning a sphere into a lower volume cylinder and hopefully leading to less bleeding into the thigh. You're also trying to limit further damage. And, some people will talk about traction splints and they will evaluate them thinking, oh, look how well the bones have realigned on an x-ray. But I think that is not a real target. It's nice if you pull broken bones apart and they realign. But depending on the fracture site, there's no traction splint out there that will do perfect realignment for every femur fracture. So it's nice, but it's not a main target of traction splints. All right, so this is an article. I just wanted to bring this up. This is from 2004, Traction Splint and EMS Relic. And the authors of this created a bit of a stir back in the day. I remember I commented on it. Sam Scheinberg of Sam Splint, a few other people commented here. And I understand the exasperation back in the day. There were, I think, the Sager Splint, the Hare, maybe Donway, Thomas. Those were probably the most commonly seen splints back then. And there was frustration. And that probably led these authors to come up with an article saying, maybe we should throw away the traction splint. And to me, that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So traction is very helpful. I don't think anybody who's ever dealt with a patient who had a femur fracture would say otherwise. It helps to stretch out a broken femur. However, the devil's in the details. And so how best to do that? And so what I would say is build a better traction splint. So I'm going to go into now the history of the STS. Back in 1998, I was doing my emergency medicine residency at the University of New Mexico. And I remember training on the Hare, the Sager traction splint, and I'd already seen the Hare. And I thought to myself, geez, these seem quite bulky. It's causing a fair bit of pain to apply the splint, and they extend a fair distance past the leg. And so to me, it was more like, is there a way to do this in a simpler, cleaner, less bulky way? And so that, set my mind going down a lot of different ways of creating mechanical advantage. The impression that you get from these products is that it takes enormous force to counteract femoral quadriceps spasm. And what I've learned over the years is that's really not the case. But so I went down a lot of different rabbit holes. I thought about, types of pneumatic or hydraulic systems, cranks. And eventually, I think my father and I started talking about pulley mechanisms. And so that led to, so here's a slide. This is what my textbooks had in them about femoral traction at the time. There's a picture of the Thomas splint. There's some improvisation with sticks. You can drill a pin through bone and hang weights. And then this is what, I took this picture, I think in 2002, perhaps. This just shows how far the Hare and the Kendrick splint extend past the foot. All right, but moving to the history a little bit more, tried a lot of different designs and eventually made, I have it right here. So this was the STS version 1, and this is enormous. It's steel, it weighs 5 pounds, and I built it with 8-to-1 mechanical advantage. And that just shows my own perception of how much force it takes to stretch a leg. I put this picture in because that is, I'm smiling there because this is the first time I've applied it, and that's my dad's leg. First time I applied it, it looks like it is working well, but the better picture would be probably 10 or 20 minutes later. If you see here, I had a hook on this side, a hook on this side, and it was not a light bulb moment. It was more just like, can we just flip it? And that led to the going down this world of traction from the hip. And really, I think that's one of the most important parts of our splints, STS-C, Gen 2 and STS now, is that now we can pull from the hip to create traction. And that changes the whole dynamic of traction splinting. Prior to that, it's caregiver against patient. I'm going to do this to you, and you're going to feel better. And that is a different dynamic from, I'm going to put this cord in your hand, we're going to pull together until you feel better. So it's just a little bit of finesse. I have a couple of other prototypes shown here. I went down very light PVC road. I think I got this from a window washer, tubing, telescoping tubing, and eventually made the decision that why don't we use telescoping ski or hiking poles? And so you can see this is my mother in the garage / sweatshop. We bought 50 black diamond hiking poles. We started painting them up and cutting slots and making traction splints out of it. Those were never for sale, but these were all prototypes. This image here is one of the first uses of one of our various prototypes. And eventually we wound up launching a hiking pole / ski pole version of the traction splint. And I will say, it makes me sad that it doesn't really exist anymore because it was a fun product. I would hike with it, ski with it, and if needed, traction a leg with it. There was another part of this pole that was kind of fun. I could put dislocated shoulders in with it too. So if you attach it to an arm, and you can actually have a patient stretch their own arm to the point of shoulder reduction. Sadly, that went away in part because paramedics didn't really want to have a ski pole in their ambulance. Some were afraid that it would walk away. I was told by a lot of people, you got to make something that is femur fracture specific. So that led to a different path. And what I'm demonstrating here is that the ski pole, as well as all of these other splints, they work with evacuum splints. You can put them on a backboard. You can put them in a box splint. This is someone demonstrating in Antarctica. In 2006, that is the first time that we really had a traction splint that looked somewhat like what we have today. I had about 200 of them made. These are my legs at the Heart Hospital of New Mexico, and you can see what it looked like back then. One big difference between this version and today, I used cam locks at the time. And even though they work, it's just a struggle because if it loosens a little bit, people will say, "Oh, this is garbage," because it's slipping. And when all you have to do is tighten the screw, but that's enough for people to say, "I don't like it anymore." So we changed it off to thumb screws. All right, so that was 2006. You'd like to think that was a decade of success, but really this was a decade of me thinking, what in the world am I doing? There's a lot of time and a lot of money spent and not getting anywhere. 2008, at the end of the year, I got a call from a man in Singapore, Manoj Balakrishnan. He said, I want to put in a tender for the SAF, Singapore Armed Forces. And a month later, I was out there demonstrating. And then 3 or 4 months later, they bought more than 1,000. And so that is really the launch point for the traction splint, and it gave it a lot more credibility. So to everybody in Singapore, thank you very much. Phil Carey with Rescue Essentials saw the traction splint and said, you know what, let's launch this in the US. He licensed the patent with Rescue Essentials. And they say the rest is history, but it's sort of, the rest is a lot of history. In any case, moving this along, I'm going to go do some demos now. So right now, I'm going to stop sharing and just show you how this looks on my leg. All right. This is the STS Rescue Essentials. I'm going to open it up. And the most important parts are all here. There is, I should have worn a light shirt for some contrast. This is an end cap. I'm going to put it on my leg. I don't think many people ski in Singapore, but there are ski patrollers on this call. So I'm going to show you how this works on the ski boot. And there we go. And mind you, you can put this strap over a ski boot. You can also put it proximal to a ski boot. You can put it proximal to the cap. Put it over the ski boot. Have it locked right there, and I'm pointing the cap up. If I am putting it on the other leg, then the cap will point up in this direction. My next step is I'm going to put the female buckle anterior to my thigh. The male end is going behind my thigh. And this does not have to be very tight. I loosen, I call this the course adjustment. So I loosen that, get this into place, extend it, and now lock. And then this is the point where I can, as a caregiver, I can pull directly, but I can also put this in the patient's hand and say, I'm going to pull this with you until you feel maximum relief. There's a pulley system inside, and my leg is getting stretched out. Lock this in place, and I can say that I'm done almost. There's a mid-leg strap as well. This says apply this side towards patient, so set it here. I prefer to apply this distal to the knee, just so that you can see the full line, and then wrap around. And so now I have traction plus rotational stability. And mind you, that doesn't have to be the end of it. I can put, as I said before, you can put in a vacuum splint, you can put all their kinds of straps, but this is sort of, this gets the job done of traction plus splinting. I'm going to take this off and just show you one other quick thing with this splint. So loosen this up here. Should have done some yoga before this to stretch me out. So this can be applied proximal to the calf. And again, you know, this was not a light bulb moment. This was more just like, oh, that works too. So let's try it. Tighten that down, and again, I pull, and my leg is being stretched, and I can just wrap this around the calf or around both lower extremities if I want. All right, that is the demo for the STS. And you know, I will say these other things. There's other points about it. It doesn't extend past the leg at all. That was obvious. This fits everybody, kids, adults. And let me put this down here. This is, you know what I'm gonna do is the Gen 2 next. All right, so this is the one that we just released. And what you'll see inside of it, Slishman pressure ramp, I could do a whole webinar on just this, but I will save you from that right now. There's the Gen 2. There's a red strap here, and I'm gonna put it on this leg now. So you'll see, okay. Mind you, this strap will go proximal to the calf, over the ankle, or proximal to the boot as well. And then my next step, once again, I want the female buckle to be anterior to the thigh. But my next step is to pick out how far I'm going to pull this middle silver tube out. It turns out that this works. I can put in the middle spring button hole or the proximal point, and they both work on me. So I'll leave it at the middle point so you can see the mechanism a little bit better. I lock this in place. Doesn't have to be too tight. And then my traction comes from up here. I pull and then lock. And for the original, the cord, once it's locked in place, the cord doesn't have ongoing tension. Here, the cord is what is maintaining the tension. So you'll notice there's no more thumb screws. It's just the cord that does the lock. And it's quite easy to adjust and readjust. Just pull and lock and then release. The pressure wrap it's added for one main reason, to give rotational stability. I'm not going to put you through all that, but you wrap it around one foot and then the other foot, and you get rotational stability from that. And one nice part of doing it that way is you're not having to lift the leg up at all. If you just pull the feet together, then people feel better. All right. And for the STS-C, actually, I will pile of splints down there now. For the STS-C, this was built for anybody that cares about pack size. So, you know, special forces were interested in something like this. Air medical, ski patrollers really lean more towards the longer one so that they can anchor to the ankle as well. But if all you want to do is femoral traction, then that's what this accomplishes. And it's really the most compact, simple way that I can think of to do it. I'll just put this on really quick here to make sure that you see what's happening. This goes proximal to the calf. Similar situation here. Buckle, female buckle anterior. And I'm going to pull this out until that spring button locks. Lock that in place. And then again, my traction is the exact same mechanism as previously. So I pull and lock. And that's it. And it has a black pressure wrap that you can use for bleeding control, but you also can wrap around the feet for rotational stability. Put these in the pile. And now I'm going to go back to sharing. All right, so I'm going to go through a variety of FAQs, frequently asked questions now, probably 10 or 12 of them. So FAQ number one, what are the biggest differences between these three splints? And you don't have to read each of these line items, but I'll just go through them quickly for you. The weight of the original is, and I have to say, imperial units versus metric units. If the US is still on imperial units in 100 years, we're moving. You got that? So I can't stand imperial units. However, we'll continue to do it. 23 ounces for the original, the 17 ounces for the G2. The STS-C is 14.6 ounces, so it's quite light. You can see the length differences. I'm not going to read all the numbers to you. The inner pole, the middle pole color is silver for the G2. I wanted to have some color differentiation to make it easier for people to understand the instructions. So it's more than just pull the middle pole. Look for the silver pole, pull that out. The innermost poles are actually plastic molded, and those are the same for the G2 as well as the STS-C. Proximal strap color is red for the G2, not for the C. And then there are, for the proximal and distal attachment points, we have plastic end caps of the original. And I should say that it's shocking to me that those end caps continue to exist in their current form. Because today I know a little bit of CAD. Back in the day, those end caps come from me drawing on a piece of paper, taking a picture and sending them to the manufacturer. And so anyway, I would do them differently, and now the G2 exists, so I'm happy about that. Course adjustment lock mechanism. So it's a thumb screw for the original and spring button for the G2 as well as the C. The lock mechanism you saw was different. I have a V cleat in the Gen 2 and the C. There's a little bit less mechanical advantage for the Gen 2 and the C. I would say it's actually more appropriate mechanical advantage. And then rotational stability comes from the pressure wraps in the Gen 2 and the C. They're also better padded too. Those end caps they are padded, but not as well as they are for the Gen 2 and the C. Fewer steps to apply the later versions. The bags are a bit different. I think I can put them on faster too. And then because of the pressure wraps, there's a little more multi-utility with the Gen 2 and the C. If anybody wants this drawing, I'm happy to send it to you. All right, FAQ number 2, are the Splints radiolucent? And this one gives me a bit of heartburn periodically, because I will say, I would like to say relatively radiolucent, because the only thing that's really radiolucent is outer space. But relative to bone, it's radiolucent. On a clinical level, it doesn't impact my ability to visualize bone. Whereas a thick hunk of steel, like in the Thomas and the hair, the Sager, these things will obstruct your view of fractures. If you put these splints on, they are aluminum, and you can see bone pretty well. So to a physicist, no, they're not radiolucent. Also, can you do an MRI with these splints on? I've never tried, and I'd like to, because I'm really curious how much this small, there's a couple of washers in there that are steel, and the screws, how much of a difference would those make in an MRI? But anyway, no to an MRI. Maybe one day I'll make these products with nylon or some type of plastic, but I think clinically it's not too relevant having the ability to do an MRI, not in the emergency department. Anyway, patient comes through, we do CT scans with these without a problem. All right, next point here, any contraindications? So I'm gonna go straight to my line there. So these are splints first that just happen to offer traction, and you can splint anything you want. So if somebody says, I think I broke my leg, do you need more than that to splint them. And I think no, I think you can apply these and give some stability. Traction is the gravy, is the bonus. So you can pull a little bit of traction. Does that feel better? If they say they feel better, what's the problem? So it is still okay to use these, even if you have injury to the tib fib, to the knee, proximal femur, the pelvis. A lot of these long lists of contraindications are a result of prior traction splints. So I have this image on the right here of a proximal femur fracture. And if you have a hair traction splint, people would say you shouldn't have used it in this case because proximal femur, the proximal side of the hair traction splint is acting like a fulcrum. That's no good. So as a contraindication, you shouldn't have done that. Nobody should ever fault you for putting these splints on as splints. And my only caveat, my only slight contraindication is if you have a patient who, and mind you, yesterday I was talking with Terry Smith about this, about open versus closed fracture. So if I have an open fracture, I really separate that into two groups. So open fracture as in there's a puncture and I think it's broken, not really sure. That I consider you can traction. But if you have an open fracture that is bone sticking out and it's caked in mud, probably don't apply traction and pull that mud back into the body. So I would say there are no absolute contraindications to applying these as splints. All right, what if my patient is a professional basketball player? So meaning very, very tall. Just apply it proximal to the calf. And this image brings up a question sometimes. What about a nerve palsy there? And it's very hard. Oh, shit, it's really quick here. We experimented with a few different mechanisms to tighten down on the proximal calf. And any kind of cinch you can pull tight and perhaps cause a problem. I think it's very hard to do that, but in any case, with this type of mechanism, you have Velcro here, and you just basically pull until that adheres, and you just can't cinch to create a tourniquet. And so I am not like nobody's ever said I have tingly calf toes, some kind of neuropraxia from it's just not. Nobody's ever said there was any kind of nerve injury from applying any of these splints. I can see if you don't give rotational stability, then perhaps rotating out and having this end cap pushing directly on that superficial perineal nerve, maybe something could happen, but I think the risk is exquisitely low. That is a long answer to the question. If you have a tall person, apply it proximal to the calf if needed. All right, do they work for kids? Yes, absolutely. And I just have these three photos here. There's a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. They don't all have broken femurs, but this is what it looks like to apply the original, the STS, to kids. Clinically, however, it's not all that useful. For kids, it's better to splint. A shorter and shorter limb. You can just use it as a splint, and I don't think you need nearly as much traction. But the finesse is in the groin strap. So for a 1-year-old, what you'll do is essentially just lengthen the groin strap if needed. All right, can they be used with a pelvic binder? So if I have a crushed pelvis and a femur fracture, step one is the pelvic binder. And yes, these can be applied directly over. And then this is a bit of a decision tree. So if you have somebody with a multi-trauma, crushed pelvis, broken femur, mangled lower extremity, the way I think through that is, well, actually, the March algorithm. You want to stop massive bleeding first. So direct pressure to stop bleeding. But if somebody has a crushed pelvis, you want to pull that together first with a pelvic binder, followed by a thermal traction splint, and then start working on the lower extremity. So you can use a SAM splint or otherwise to stabilize the lower extremity. All right, will any of these splints work for a broken humerus? I have not tried it. However, there's a doctor in France who has, and he says he's used it a bunch of times and patients seem to feel better. I would love for anybody to publish that paper. So maybe this is, he sent one of a photo of an x-ray of him using it back in the day. And this is what it looked like. All right, mechanical advantage. And this is sort of, this comes up a fair bit. And I guess this will be a longer part of the talk. So there is the CT6. It's made by Fairtech. And the CT6 is a carbon fiber version that is similar to the KTD, but it has a pulley mechanism distally. And on Fairtech's website, they have this image. They show, all right, if I pull 40 pounds, then the output force is less than 10 pounds with the KTD. It's a 1-inch webbing. I pull, and I don't get as much force out. With the Fairtech, with the CT6, if I pull that cord, theoretical 4-to-1 advantage, I get a lot more mechanical advantage. And you can see if I pull 40 pounds, I get a little bit less than 35 pounds. But you do a, wait a minute, I took high school physics. What's happening here? And I think what you see is just how much goes into friction. So 4-to-1, it should be quite a bit more. I mean, you should get 160 pounds of output force. So in any case, a lot of the pull goes to friction. I did a similar type of analysis with our splints, the STS as well as the STS-C. But it is a difficult thing to figure out because if I hold let me see if I can show you this well. If I hold the middle and outer tubes fixed and pull from here, that is one mechanical advantage. If I hold the inner tube fixed and pull from here, that's another mechanical advantage. Theoretically, 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1. And so what I did in the experiment was I locked this portion and I hung weights from here and then measured the output tug. And the bottom line is, for the STS, you get a little bit more mechanical advantage. I don't pay attention to this part here. That was a experiment failure as opposed to product failure. And then if you hold the inner portion fixed, you get this. So the answer, because both of these parts move, is going to be a line that lands somewhere in here. And I know that's maybe not very fascinating to a lot of people. And I will add this one little bit. It doesn't matter. So the KTD works. It doesn't take a whole lot of force to traction a leg. 5 to 15, 20 pounds of force usually gets the job done. So this is why I call the topic of mechanical advantage a false feature. Don't get hung up on those numbers. I think the answer for ours is actually pretty similar to the CT6. It's somewhere in here, which is roughly 1-to-1, but it just doesn't matter. It works. I'll say this. A couple of weeks ago, I was medical director for an air show, and a woman fell, and she either broke her proximal femur or her hip. We put the splint on, and this is the first time I've done it in the field, and I was shocked by how little tug was needed to actually make her feel better. So it just does not take much force to make people feel better with traction. All right, how long can these splints be left on? I don't think there is a specific number. It really depends on how well you monitor. So these photos here in 2010, after the Haiti earthquake, I went there with 7 traction splints and found a lot of people in one hospital who had essentially this mechanism. So somebody prior to me put plaster on, and then they hung sandbags and left them that way. And so what I did was I took a lot of these off, put the traction splints on until an orthopedist could take the patient to the OR and do whatever type of fixation they wanted to do. So the longest any of those splints were left on while I was there was, I think, up to 10 days. Once a patient went to the OR, then we cycled them and gave them to other people. So in any case, I think it's quite a long time that you can leave these on. And it really just amounts to good patient monitoring and making sure that they can move their toes and making sure that they don't have pressure sores. Any literature out there? So there are 2 good articles. You might want to look into these. I will say it's sad to me how little literature there is. And if anybody here watching this likes doing research, please publish. And I have a variety of different studies that I would love to propose as well, if you want to involve me. My problem is that anything I publish is exquisitely biased, so probably won't get accepted. So, all right, are they reusable and how best to clean them? So there is theory versus reality. The vast majority of traction splints find themselves in emergency rooms or ambulances, and they never see a patient. They sit there, they're at the ready, they're like AEDs, they don't see a femur fracture. Some fraction of them will see one patient, and then they'll be applied and they'll go to the emergency department, and they may land on a floor, they may get cut up, they may get lost. And then there's a sliver of these that would get used over and over and over and over again. I've had people tell me they've used them 5 times, and so it's unusual, but happens. So to clean them, there's just a few different points that I would make. Clean them like you would for a strap on a backboard. Avoid putting neoprene into boiling water, though, so that it can delaminate. And then to protect them, if you are going to use them more than once, I typically put a towel around the groin just to keep any urine or feces or blood off of the groin strap in particular. But those are the main points. I was talking with Terry Smith with Sign Fracture Care yesterday, and I would love to see people use these, and when they feel like they're done, I'd like them to find their way to settings where people can keep using them. So it's just sad to think of them as single-use disposable, where there's just a lot of trash in the world, and I'd like to not contribute more. So it would be great if your service thinks of this as single-use disposable, that you might take it and then get it to an agency like Sign Fracture Care. All right. Which U.S. and international agencies have adopted the Slishman traction splint? Dear Singapore, thank you very much. New York City Fire Department, LA County, a large fraction of Australia, they have shifted towards this. There are a variety of militaries in Europe as well. It's a longer and longer list, and I can connect you with Richard Bilger if you'd like the complete list as well. All right, other FAQs, I'll go through these quickly. Could I self-apply it? Obviously, yes. Could I walk with these? If I don't have a femur fracture, I can fully weight it. But with a femur fracture, pretty hard. Any complications reported? So I can think of one. The thumb screw in the original STS, somebody cranked it very tight and it protruded slightly. And somehow that protruded bit of screw got pushed into skin on a patient in Australia. And it was not a deep penetration, just created a nick. Anyway, we shortened the screw. I don't think that's going to be an issue for anybody anymore. Can you use this with bilateral femur fractures? So that question really comes from the Sager. That's one of their selling points. And what I would argue is, well, there's actually 2 answers to this question. One answer is, I know a smoke jumper who did use it with bilateral femur fractures. He had a patient with bilaterals, and he applied it proximal. And somehow he was able to figure out a way to use it to traction both legs. That would be off-label improv, but I love that he got it figured out. The I guess more snide answer is, the Sager costs twice our product. So if you're really worried about bilateral femur fractures, buy 2. Can you add a tension gauge? This also comes from the Sager as well as the Donway. With both of those, you have some ability to gauge the tension. And I've actually built a tension gauge, and there's a way to do it, but I don't want it. So I live by treat the patient, not the numbers. I think that there's never been a circumstance where I had a patient come in and I thought, let's traction them to 11. It's just not the case. You should pull that cord until your patient says, I feel better, and then lock it in place. And then you should go back to your patient and say, do you still feel better? No, you know what? I could use a little more traction. Okay, so pull a little bit more and traction. I see no value in a tension gauge. So that's the answer to that one. Why black? In 2006, it was the cheapest. Nobody was offering me custom colors. It was Henry Ford time. And then it turned out that special ops people and others like the color black. But in terms of getting people to see the product, it's a terrible color. Anyway, the Gen 2 has a few more colors to make it slightly more eye-catching. Why not carbon fiber? So this question comes up in part because of a few different traction splints out there. CT6 and 7, as well as there was a different one that I'm forgetting the name of. But I just, call me old. I really like aluminum a lot. And so for the Gen 2, this weighs 5.2 ounces. This is less than a third of the weight of the whole product. Like, I don't think we need to be trimming the weight to that extreme. And plus, it's just so easy to fabricate, and I'm not worried about cracks. I just like it. So anyway, I've experimented with carbon fiber, and any time I've tried it, it's just been very frustrating to get little cracks here and there. And I'm not into it. I think people like to say carbon fiber a lot, though. They like to say titanium. They like to say adamantium. There are sexy metals out there. I'm an old guy. I like to say aluminum. All right. What happened to the ski pole version, and can I still get one? Sad. I have about 20 of them in my attic collecting dust. I'm hoping my kids will ski with some of them someday. All right. And future directions. So I very much want this product to be thought about in hospital as well. As it is right now, it is viewed as a pre-hospital device. You apply it in the ambulance. Patients get sent into the emergency department. You find me. If you find me, I'm going to leave it on. But other people will remove traction splints and they'll put on orthoglass, or they'll do other things. And so that every transition is painful. I would like traction splints to be applied in the field, left on through the emergency department, left on through the CT scanner, left on all the way to the operating room. And even if the OR is going to be 2 or 3 days from now, I think it's okay to do that rather than assault somebody with a traction pin. And, can we replace pins entirely? This is a question for orthopedists. So I think it's quite remarkable that, you talk about adding insult to injury. I have a broken femur, and now I have somebody coming at me with a drill, and I'm going to drill a hole through my tibia, distal femur calcaneus, as in this picture, and I'm going to hang some bricks. I would like to see that go away. But I'm not an orthopedist. I'm not the expert there. If anybody wants to go down that rabbit hole of research, I would love to work with you. And then lastly, I have a neighbor. Surprisingly, he's a PT, and he has chronic knee and hip pain. And for the past 2 years, he's been applying the STS-C to his leg a couple times a day, and he just stretches his leg out, and he says it works for his chronic pain. Wonderful. I would love for it to help people with chronic knee and hip pain. Again, I can't do that study. I would love for someone to research that area. All right. So that's the talk. And now I can go to the chat here. Again, I need to introduce my kids. This is my boy, Zach and Max, demoing. He has the Gen 2 on him. And this is the STS-C. So the STS-C you can put at the ankle on kids. All right. Thanks very much. I'm going to say thank you very much to Rescue Essentials in particular for getting the product to this point.